Good morning, everybody. Oh, is that on? Okay. It's not loud. Is that better? Okay. So it looks like from the fact that folks are settled and that we're ready, that we're going to get started. So I'd like to welcome everybody who's here in person, as well as everybody who is online across this country. And of course, we have international panel guests as well. And it's really great to see so many people interested in talking about a more just option for international trade and how we consume the things that we consume. So thank you all for being here today. In case you're wondering about what's happening here on stage beyond the panel participants, we are borrowing this space from a community theater group, and so I'd like to say we put this creative set together, but we definitely didn't. And hopefully we'll have less drama than they do, but maybe not. Maybe we'll have more. So my name is Brittany Trainer Mastriani, and it's my privilege and pleasure to moderate our panel today. And before getting started, I would like to make some acknowledgements on behalf of Just Us and our panel. So I'd like to acknowledge that this morning's presentation is taking place in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and current territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726. We are all treaty people, and these treaties are still applicable today. These treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact, they recognized Mi'kmaq title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Today, this region is also home to Annapolis Valley First Nation and Glooscap First Nation, as well as a diverse urban and rural Indigenous population. Given the nature of today's conversation, I'd also like to acknowledge that the African continent is the birthplace of humanity, with the oldest civilizations, and that many things, but particularly democracy and cooperative economics, are rooted in African wisdom and are built on the backs of African-descended people. Further, I acknowledge the centuries-long displacement, disenfranchisement, lack of access, opportunity, and celebration of heritage and contribution, and systemic implications impacting the current realities of persons of African descent, specifically African Nova Scotians who have ancestral roots in this province for over 400 years. So, Gavin Friedel is a professor and Canada Research Chair in International Development Studies at St. Mary's University and a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars. He has written widely on fair trade and free trade, and his publications include Coffee, Alternative Trade Legacies for the Future, and the recent co-edited book, The Fair Trade Handbook, Building a Better World Together. He is a member of the advisory board of the Canadian Fair Trade Network and lives in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Nelson Malomaya, a producer of high quality and certified organic coffee in Cauca, Colombia, is also here with us today and has his own brand, Nelson Mellow, in the US market. He is chair and legal representative of the Organic Producers Association of Cauca and has been a board member of the Latin American and Caribbean Network of Fair Trade Small Producers and Workers, also known as CLAC. Nelson has also worked as General Secretary of the Colombian Initiative for Small Fair Trade Producers and is a past chair of the Small Producers Symbol, also known as SPP. Dr. Kate Irvin is an associate professor in the International Development Studies program at St. Mary's University and a faculty associate with the School of Environment. Her research focuses on global political economy of climate change mitigation, carbon trading and offsetting, carbon finance, and global climate justice. Kate is also the author of the book Carbon, published in 2018 with Polity Press. And last but certainly not least is my friend Joey Pituello, a worker member and general manager of the Just Us Coffee Cooperative, and a small-scale organic farmer in Hortonville. As we will learn more today, Just Us is a worker-owned cooperative inspired by the potential solutions that democratic business and supply chains offer the solidarity economy. What am I doing here talking to you people? This is such an illustrious panel, and I feel really lucky to be here. And before we continue, I have to pause and thank you all for your contributions to this book and for your life's work, both of which are a reminder to me and I think others of the persistence of unfair supply chains driven by greed, colonization, systemic discrimination, and the general devaluing of work. So gracias and thank you. We'll get into some questions, and then I think we'll be taking some from the floor in a little bit once we get ourselves warmed up. So Gavin, first for you, I wonder if you could tell me a bit more about the book and why you and others put it together.
Great, thanks very much. And Britt, thanks so much for agreeing to do this. We really appreciate it. It actually takes me back. We've been in Nova Scotia now for 10 years. And when we first arrived here, it took us a couple years to get to know the Just Us folks. And certainly Britt was right there from the beginning, as was Vicky, who always does such incredible work. And it's always a great friendship that we have with Vicky and Joey, of course. So it's really wonderful to be at this event and to see everybody again. At this point, I'm seeing you guys so often that I don't know if that counts anymore. I haven't seen Britt in a long time, but I'm seeing Joey and Vicky on a regular basis. So they're family members at this point.
Literally.
Hopefully we'll see you one day soon, Nelson, in person, not on TV. All right, so the book. Well, I'd say the book has two motivations. One of them is a motivation within the fair trade community. And so that one was just, how do we take these different voices of fair trade, these different groups that are working on similar, but often at the same time very different projects, and how do we bring them together in dialogue? And it really emerged out of these annual conferences at the Canadian Fair Trade Network, when you see all these people having these wonderful discussions and debates. And so we wanted to bring those different groups together and make the book, design the book in a way that's very accessible, very readable, I hope. There's a graphic story at the beginning of the book. But at the same time, give everybody their voice, not necessarily have chapters that agree with each other, but instead get to express their different ideas and ideals about fair trade. And it was also, I think, in terms of trade and trade justice, it was about bringing other people into the discussion that fair trade organizations kind of work with, know, are friends with, but aren't always under the same umbrella. So a lot of trade justice advocacy groups across the country are represented in the book as well, and talking about their different goals and their different ambitions for changing trade policy globally. So that's sort of like a kind of inside the community goal. And then I think the second goal is a kind of outside the community goal, which is how the community of fair traders, trade justice advocates relate to the rest of the world. And that is about, continuing to push forward with challenging and confronting global inequalities on many levels. So, at the introduction to the book, I talk a little bit about the outrageous global inequality we have in the world today. I reflect a little bit about the pandemic. There's a chapter in the book on COVID, but in the intro I reflect a bit on the pandemic. And I talk about its impact on global inequalities. And basically there are certain people in this world that have actually gotten substantially richer during the pandemic. And there's, of course, millions and millions of people that have suffered the vulnerabilities and inequalities that come with it. So one of the most famous is Jeff Bezos, who's the founder of Amazon, although now he's jetting back and forth into space all the time with celebrities. Amazon's not only what you might think it is in many ways, it's also the world's second largest retail chain, by the way. And he experienced, over the last 2 years during the pandemic, the fastest growth of personal wealth in human history. So his wealth was already enormous before the pandemic, but it leapt up by tens of billions of dollars in just a year and a half alone, so that he's worth almost $200 billion right now. I think, 5 weeks ago, he was the richest man in the world, and then suddenly Elon Musk is worth $300 billion. So they're racing each other to be the world's first trillionaire. Now, in terms of Bezos, if he were a country, he'd be the world's 50th largest country in economic terms. That's pretty interesting, because in the old days, we used to make those comments about giant companies. Now you can make them about giant individuals who are bigger than a lot of companies. So he's a little bit under Peru. He's a little bit wealthier than Iran, wealthier than Greece. And if you compare him to, say, in terms of being topical here, Ethiopia, which is the world's 6th largest coffee exporter, He's about twice the size of Ethiopia, and it's, I don't know, 125 million people. So the flip side of that immense concentration of wealth that fair traders and trade justice folks are always concerned about is, of course, the daily lives of millions and millions of small farmers and workers who have to eke it out as best they can. Sometimes, under some conditions, they do quite well, and other times they're not doing so great. And so in this one, I always like to evoke a 2017 Oxfam report that looked at living wages amongst different sectors across the world. And I only talk briefly about Kenyan coffee farmers, but they determined that the average Kenyan coffee farmer makes about 53% of a living income. So that's a pretty large gap. But to cover that gap, a consumer only needs to pay 2% more for their coffee. That 2%, though, has to go to the farmer. So in other words, a $2 cup of coffee needs to cost $2.04 for that farmer to get a living income. That 2% gap, to me, is the spirit of the book. It is central to what the book is trying to do and what it's trying to confront and what it's trying to address. And so the book itself is broken into 3 sections. The first section talks about trade injustice, colonialism, gender inequality. There's a wonderful chapter there on a specific migrant worker and the challenges they faced. The second section talks about different fair trade organizations in Canada and internationally, and the various projects and what they've tried to do to try to create fairer trade. And the final section of the book is on advocacy and trade justice, talking about different approaches to how we can change global trade.
Awesome, thank you. You know, I really appreciate you talking about the marginal cost to consumers for a more just experience for all. And when I talk to people about fair trade, I always kind of, I mean, it's a bit crass, but tell them, you know, if you look at how much you actually might contribute to charity models, fair trade's the best deal in town. For 4 cents, you're never gonna have that much impact anywhere else. So it's a really compelling way to consider the way and the accessibility of fair trade and how it's so easy for consumers to actually participate in that work. Next question is for Nelson and Joey. You have a chapter in the book where you dialogue with each other about the need to decolonize fair trade. I wonder if you could each tell me a bit about that and what it means to you and your organization.
Did you want to go first, Nelson?
Thank you. I'd like to take this occasion to thank you all for all this work you've been doing. At the end of the day, it's good for everyone, for all humanity. It's not about finding new markets or defend interests of certain groups of the planet. It's about having a better life for everyone. And the central thing here is trade, markets. And we see it's very it's very worrying to see that this issue of globalization and global economy, it's been not so good for our countries. Our countries were forced to sign treaties where it's forbidden for us to use our own native seeds, and we have to buy seeds from multinationals, and that was not enough. Some years ago, we've been working on fair trade to be able to find a better position for our products and to be able to find a better way for our families to have a better life. Unfortunately, we've also had problems, as you just called it, conventional fair trade. We identified the necessity, we the small producers, we found the necessity to find an alternative to this conventional fair trade. And so we created a network of small producers who work only based and respecting the original values and principles of fair trade. so that our voice is heard. That's why we are here today trying to move forward and fight against globalized world and fight against government policies that do not take into account the realities of the planet, because it's not a problem about small producers, it's the planet who's suffering. And with a situation that it also involves producers, because consumers, sorry, because they sometimes they don't have enough information due to all these marketing strategies. They believe they're doing something good, but at the end they're also cheated upon. And for us, decolonizations, that means that everyone has the possibility, has enough possibilities that nobody is cheated upon, and the market allows us to have healthy relationships, that everyone is able to grow, and that we all have benefits from this market growth, and also that our planet is is has better conditions. We believe that this is the right thing. When we started to create this network of small producers based on the principles and values of what fair trade should be and how it started. Nowadays, I believe we have achieved a lot. We're happy, but we need more consumers, more companies, more ethical companies, fully ethical companies, not companies that use brands and labels and concepts. If their business goals, I believe we have to keep on working on that in that sense. And I think that this book, this information, I think that actors like you and like us, we can show the truth to the world. We can achieve something. We can make a better world.
Thanks for that, Nelson. Um, I think it's really it's kind of, we talk about decolonization of the fair trade, and you hear Nelson several times, talking about going back to the original concepts of fair trade, and the reality is that, back in the '80s, when this first kind of formalized version of fair trade came to be, it, the small producers were at the table. They brought the ideas, but when you really look at the process from those early days, they never actually had, they weren't voting for those decisions, even with Fair Trade International model back in those early days. And, and yet they were the ones that really had the ideas. They were the ones that were going to implement this ultimately and make it viable. And I think it just us, in terms of our perspective on decolonizing fair trade, I think it's really important for us to realize we sell, tea, chocolate, sugar, and coffee. These are all products. The only reason they're so popular, the only reason that they're global commodity, is because of the slave trade and colonialism. That is the only reason. And when we first started the co-op 25 years ago, when Jeff Moore, our founder, kind of had the original idea, it was very much never, the only way he was going to get into that business as a co-op was to make sure that, that we were somehow breaking away from this, quote unquote legacy. I mean, it's still a problem. There's still lots of issues with the value chain and with how these products are produced around the globe. But fair trade, being the first licensee for fair trade here in Canada, Just Us was kind of leading the way and engaging in that. And I came to the organization, really feeling like I knew something about fair trade. I was somebody that was very sensitive to the idea of exploiting anybody or anything for the things that I bought. But really, as I went through various positions within Just Us and started to work more and more closely with small producers, I really started to realize how the patterns of colonialism were ingrained within my behaviors and my activities with those producers. And it was surprising at times, and I was really fortunate to have the trust of we've had long-term relationships with producer partners, some of them as many as 25 years old. And then being involved with SPP. I've been on the board for the last 3 or 4 years of SPP. I'm on the board because producers voted me onto the board. I had no say in that, and that's an interesting piece that SPP has brought to the table in terms of these original foundational concepts. Is that producers are the ones with all the voice. Buyers are there, not just the voice, but the vote. Buyers are there with the voice, and that's all. It stops there. And I think that's really critical for shifting the power dynamic that exists, and that's the power dynamic that I realized I was even perpetuating through my conversations with producers over the last few years. Even though I was a strong proponent of fair trade and really felt like I understood, it was a great honor to be working with people like Nelson over these years, and them to kindly make me aware of those moments where I was very much acting like a typical person from the North, even though I thought I was doing so with great hopes in the process of doing things differently. It wasn't necessarily coming through. And so this dialogue that goes on in our article within the book was really about what we were trying to do. What I was hoping to do with my part of this was to really take people through a bit of the journey that I went through over the last 8 or 10 years in conversations with producers, and obviously condense it, and with the guidance of Nelson through that article, really start to understand where some of these patterns show up. So it's really critical in our organization, it's really critical for me that we start to really dive deep and be open to how we are perpetuating those patterns, those power dynamics in our everyday conversations. And this article was our way of doing that together, Nelson and I. So I'm really proud to have had the opportunity to work with Nelson on it. Thanks.
Thank you both. Nelson's comments about seed and food sovereignty as a contrast to colonial structures, and it made me think about how mastery of the natural world that persists in conventional everything is such a colonial way of being. And it's nice to hear that organizations, albeit a settler organization like Just Us, is still working so diligently to address and redress those kind of impacts. I remember a couple years ago, probably about 5, having conversations with you about possessive terminology and language when you're talking about producer partners. And it's just so pervasive in everything that we do. So it's great to see leadership from organizations like yours. Kate, you're next in my hot seat. You have a chapter in the book that asks if trade policy can be more fair, looking at different examples of global, regional, or national governance. I know, of course, that you're absolutely an expert on climate change. How are things looking these days for climate change policy globally or nationally?
Thank you for the question, and it's great to be able to come together and talk about all of the issues that we're exploring today. And I think, so much of what has already been said then also applies to questions and discussions around climate breakdown. And so I came at the chapter that I, co-authored with Gavin, with this question of, what examples do we have, or thinking about making trade policy fair, but then also looking at that because, there's so many parallels that we see between a global trading system that has been built through these historical processes of exploitation and colonialism and imperialism, whereby the producers, the farmers, so many that actually produce the goods that we then enjoy, are marginalized and disadvantaged and making the least. And they are made vulnerable through the workings of this system. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about what that system then means, whereby you have so many vulnerable people within that supply chain, and it works that way in terms of keeping people vulnerable. So they're not getting paid fair wages, there's a lack of dignity with the work that they do. And then thinking about, well, what does that mean when climate breakdown comes and settles on top of or as part of that vulnerability and that marginalization that people are already experiencing. And so, when we start talking about the impacts of climate breakdown, and we think about small producers, for example, what does it mean when there's more drought, devastating storms, crop failures, loss of livelihoods, flooding, increasing indebtedness as they try to make their way through these crises that keep coming and coming and coming, forced migration because they're losing everything. And so, there's a lot of interesting work that's now looking at, well, what does it mean for coffee farmers, for example, whether it's in Guatemala or other places, who, because they're not getting any rain, that's it. And so there's that side of it, thinking about the impacts of climate breakdown, and then this question of, can climate policy be fair? Can it be made fair? And that's a tough one. And so if there's anyone in the audience right now that's, following what's going on at the global level, that the Conference of the Parties is happening in Glasgow right now, and global leaders and, representatives from all over the world are meeting in Glasgow to try to finalize the Paris Agreement and to try to increase ambition. And I wish I could say that when we wrote the chapter, I felt, yes, climate policy, it's been really fair, and we've got a great example here. Not that there aren't things that are happening, but what I would say is that, if we look at the experience of global climate policy, starting with the Kyoto Protocol, that was supposed to lower emissions 5.2% below 1990 levels for the rich countries only, because of their historical responsibility for causing the problem, we didn't achieve our goals. And so there was no real repercussions. With free trade agreements, we know there's repercussions. So we design our policies very differently depending on what's going on. Free trade is about supporting the system, whereas climate policies that are meaningful actually challenge the nature of the system. And so it's much harder to get effective climate policy. And so now the Paris Agreement has been in place since 2015, and emissions have been going up globally. It's voluntary. Now, that was required because countries weren't going to agree to actually sign on to an agreement that was legally binding in terms of what they had to do. So it's up to each country to say what it is they're going to do. And so that makes it really challenging as well, because there's no real mechanism for making sure it happens. And the history so far shows us that it's not happening. So Canada's emissions, they continue to go up, and we buy pipelines and we do various kinds of things that don't allow us to engage in fair policy, fair climate policy, because Canada's got the historical responsibility. We need to do more, recognizing that the poorest have contributed the least to the problem. And so, and then the last issue that I would kind of flag when it comes to climate policy. So, the wealthier nations haven't been doing their fair share. We don't have these legally binding requirements. And one of the really big issues at the meeting in Glasgow that's happening right now is climate finance to the global south. And so rich countries first committed in 2009, again, based on their historical responsibility for contributing to climate breakdown globally, to raise $100 billion per year by 2020 for climate finance to the global south. That commitment wasn't met by 2020, and we've been told now that 2023 is when we can expect it to be met. Official figures tell us we're about 80 billion in, I think that was 2019. Oxfam has done research showing that, in fact, if we take into account the amount of money that has actually gone to the global south that wasn't loans, then, and other, problematic finance means, then we're looking at 20-something billion instead of a $100 billion commitment. So one, we've got this historical responsibility. It's only fair that the North help finance in meaningful ways, the transition, and not just mitigation, but also adaptation and loss and damage for all of the storms and the droughts and everything else that are making people more vulnerable. In the Paris Agreement, rich countries said we have no legal liability to pay for loss and damage from the kinds of, devastating climate impacts that are being experienced in the global south. So they got that language in there. For mitigation and adaptation, the vast majority is coming in the form of loans, and many of them are non-concessional loans, meaning that they're at, market interest rates, so that poor countries are going more into debt to actually pay for the impacts of climate change or to do it differently. And interesting work showing that 100 billion was a completely arbitrary number. So the commitments that have come from the global south to meet their Paris Agreement commitments and targets, it would cost many trillions of dollars to meet half of what they said they want to do. And so this is a crucial thing, and what we've seen is that the North has been unwilling to actually do what's required. And again, so trade is not, dealing with unfair trade is not part of what we're talking about when it comes to climate policies, but they're directly implicated. So I think there's ways to make it fair, but the question is, where does power fit into that?
As soon as you mentioned the legal loopholes, instantly I was like, but what about the moral and ethical imperatives? So I'll think about that when I ask Joey and Nelson. How have you been considering climate change in your organizations? And are there specific projects that you have developed or challenges you have faced?
Why don't you go ahead, Nelson?
Thank you. Yes. We've been feeling the effects of climate change for a long time. The first thing that we observed in our country was plagues, diseases in our plantations, and this makes Colombia to make the decision to work with more resistant seeds. That also generates difficulties for small producers because that kind of seeds that demands a packet of fertilizers that costs a lot more, and that makes us more dependent on the global economy. We in Organica, we are 120 families of small producers, and we've been working together for 21 years. We've been working with organic certification. We've been having difficulties lately due to three main issues. One, soil erosion. Then all these long periods of drought and winter, that makes it difficult to handle plantations, and their health is being affected, and also the quality of our products. Because of that, we've been working in hand with Joey and other allies on a specific project to be able to conserve our soils and to improve the quality and the productivity of our plantations. We've also been working hard with Joey when it comes to producing liquid and solid fertilizers within our own farms. Those fertilizers, those plants, we call them bioplants. And thanks to the support of people from Latin America who are experts on that, we have that information and we are able to produce our own organic fertilizers, be able to preserve our soils and to improve productivity. It's been a difficult change to do. It also implies cultural transformations, but the results that we've been having allow us to have this, be able to handle this new technology and to produce a better coffee. We've also been working to generate microclimates in our farms. We've understood, thanks to our own experiences, observing the effects of climate change, that we have to cover the soil and generate a protecting layer with the help of trees to be able to keep humidity and to avoid radical temperature changes. We've been advancing to plant trees. We've started to understand that, yes, it is true that we talk a lot about this preoccupations, but we have to start to do something in our plantations, because nobody is going to come from the government or from companies. They're not going to come to us to help us. We are working in our own places, people and consumers. Well, I have to say, not everyone is aware of that. And we at Organica, we are lucky enough to have allies that are helping us with this kind of projects. We've also worked to diversify our production, even if for one organic farm, such as the one I have, they have 14 or between 14 and 21 products. Many of those products do not reach markets because there's not enough interest from consumers. So those products are only for our self-consumption. And one of the biggest limitations that we face, that our families face, is how to obtain money to be able to pay for education and basic needs to have a good life. That's the work we've been doing, and we believe today that the solution protect soils, to improve quality, to work even harder to achieve agroecological goals. And we are sure that we are on the right way. We've heard before, you mentioned some studies that said that small producers, we are not competitive enough, and looking at the effects of nature, and we see that today it's been proven that small producers system is the best system to produce, because we seek for balance. We protect land. That's the kind of projects we've been working on. Thank you.
And I'll just quickly chime in to say, I think my first real, run in with climate change and the role I was playing at Just Us was back in 2013, and Nelson was referring to resistant coffee tree seeds that have been developed, and they're developed to resist coffee leaf rust, which was, there was a huge epidemic of coffee leaf rust in 2013, and basically and it was in particularly Central America. I mean, Colombia has been dealing with coffee leaf rust for decades now, but it really made a leap into Central America in 2013. And we had some producer partners that, you know, only collected 10% of their typical annual yield as a result of the damage, and that many of the trees died, if not in the first year, in the second year, because it basically strips the trees of their leaves, and they're not able to photosynthesize, and when they grow the next year, they strip more of their energy from the plant, and ultimately they'll die. And it was, I mean, we, in our naivete at the time, you know, we thought, well, we put a coffee leaf rust recovery premium in place. And the idea was to try to compensate for the yield losses. I mean, the challenge was that, of course, we couldn't get anywhere near I mean, we would have had to, you know, with a 10% of yield, you know, you'd basically be, you know, 10 times the price you'd normally pay just to make up for the yields that those producers were losing. So for a small organization like ours, you know, we had to cap that, and even then it was a strain, as luckily that first year we had a basically par with the US dollar, but we're buying this coffee in US dollars, transitioning to buying them with Canadian dollars. And in the following years, when we tried to keep that program going, it was quite risky for the business. In fact, you know, our cost of goods went so far that it was a really risky time. And so we realized, wow, you know, we're just such a small drop in the bucket in terms of what we're doing, and yet there's these big organizations out there, you know, that could be doing more, but it really brought home to us how big of an issue this climate change thing was going to be. That was 3 or 4 years. I mean, there's been general recovery from coffee leaf rust, but everybody's living with it now in Latin America, and it brings damage every year. And the solutions to it are often expensive ones for small producers, except in the case, and you know, Nelson spoke a little bit about, is the last thing. Like, we've been working on a project every year. If we make a profit at Just Us, we take 10% of it and it's set aside for producer-driven, producer-led projects. And the one that Organica has been doing in Cauca, the co-op that Nelson is part of, was these biofabricas is what they call them. It's kind of like it's a production plant where they grow their own biology, their own fungi and bacteria and other compost and fermented products that they can apply back onto the soil. And ultimately, you know, Nelson speaks of, you know, the benefits it has for their production, for their quality of their products, and for the building of their soil. And, you know, in terms of this conversation around climate change, one of the reasons that soil health grows so much is because of the carbon that's being incorporated back into the soil through the methods that they use. And these are all internally done by their members. It doesn't require huge expense, and it requires their labor. And they're doing this work all the time, small producers are. And we're not paying them for that additional work. And, you know, this concept of drawdown, this concept of putting carbon into the soil, not, you know, pumping it into a cavity deep within the earth, but actually incorporating it into the soils that grow the food that we eat, and grow it better because that carbon's there. I mean, what an amazing thing to be able to do. And these folks in these agroforestry systems across the global south are doing this on a daily basis when they do these things organically and in a regenerative, organic way. And they're not being recognized for it. And it's frankly, we're talking about billions and trillions of dollars in financiers at the, you know, COP26. And what I want to hear about is how small producers are going to be compensated for the hard work they're doing, despite the fact that we put it all in the air. You know, it's definitely troubling for sure. But you know, the respect I have for small producers and that hard work they do can't really be put into words for sure.
Thank you both. With respect to having respect for small producers. I remember when I was fortunate enough to go to Origin and try my hand at picking coffee. It took me a couple hours to get half a pound of cherries. So 2 things I know for sure. The work is to be respected, and I would not thrive as a coffee producer. For many reasons, probably. But let's talk about this a little bit more, because Nelson made the comment with respect to government intervention, quote, nobody is coming to help us. So Joey, specifically to you, and then the panel more broadly, if anybody wants to chime in, do brands have an obligation to say no to consumer demands that you know cause harm to producers and environments? We think about Bezos, his rapid accumulation of substantive change in his net worth personally, Amazon's change. I think about when the global north developed an appetite for quinoa, a staple grain for people, and it became a competing priority to export it versus feeding families. And so it's a conventional way of thinking that growth at all costs is worthwhile because it creates wealth. Obviously, wealth for who? Because of who is being exploited. Those are all questions we're considering here today. But what is the responsibility of brands to say to consumers, no, I'm not making money doing that?
Well, I mean, that's a really good one. That one wasn't in the script.
It wasn't.
And
You were just so compelling, it came to me.
that's right. Well, I mean, at Just Us, I guess we can, to speak from experience, it's challenging even for us to go out and make statements that, we fear might, surface the ire of our customers. This is a reality that we deal with as an organization that generally, philosophically speaking, is quite progressive in terms of social and environmental justice. It still ends up being measured to some degree. But we're a small company, and people have lots of options when it comes to coffee. So there's the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musks of the world, that Gavin had kind of mentioned earlier. There's not a lot of folks. These folks have a lot of power. The Meta and what it's now called. These platforms have so much impact, and yet, so I in my own personal view, yes, they do have an obligation to consider, social wealth and environmental wealth, in addition to, our more conventional kind of financial wealth way of looking at things. And frankly, if they were to do so, I think governments would have to take note, especially these businesses of these sizes, but because they don't, nothing happens, and, governments dance with the idea of maybe regulating them more, and the debate goes on for years, and maybe we do it, and maybe we don't. But, my personal opinion is, yes, there is a responsibility there, but it's slow to surface. I think there's a generational shift about, and I just hope that it comes about quick enough.
That's a great question, actually. And, it's kind of funny. Like, first of all, in terms of the digital industry with Bezos and Musk, who's now worth $300 billion, the interesting thing with the digital industry, they have the opposite of that commitment that you're talking about, or with any big company. And that's, I think, part of the unfortunate nature of the way the world's set up, is that it's the opposite of that commitment. So there's actually a lot of literature coming out now on digital colonialism. And what's happening is that a handful of very gigantic digital companies, we all know which ones they are, Microsoft and Facebook and Amazon and the rest, they're collecting all the world's digital data. And that means that if you're, say, in India, millions and millions and millions of pieces of digital data are created every day by everybody's everyday behavior. But that digital data is being stored and held by a handful of Western transnational companies and some Chinese ones. And there's a lot of countries in the world, including India, that talk about policies to block that so that their own digital industries can grow and thrive. And the big push nowadays in international trade circles is for digital free trade agreements, basically banning countries from what they call localization, banning countries from having rules that say if the data is created in our country, it has to stay and be stored in our country. And there's this IT for Change out of India, and they call this the newest phase of colonialism. They're calling it digital colonialism because the knowledge and the information, that data, is the raw material of the future economy. And it's being accumulated en masse in the handful of just a few companies, and not by the people or countries that produce a lot of that data. And the same thing is going to happen with small farmers, that they're going to be drawn into using apps increasingly for their farming and their data there. But food rights groups are worried that that data is going to be stored and held by big companies and then sold back to people, the information, the use of that data, to the people that actually produced it. And small farmers will give the data, but they won't be able to afford to purchase the fancy features. But in terms of the other question, I think that's really interesting. I mean, what I think, like Just Us maybe couldn't really afford the coffee leaf rust premium the way they would have liked. But as a gesture, as a symbol, I would say that that's what distinguishes something like fair trade from what most companies want. And what most companies want nowadays is to look very ethical, as long as it doesn't cost them any money, and as long as there's no long-term commitments. And I think that's the trick we have to get over. You guys will see the TV commercials on TV or on YouTube these in the last month or so about Tim Hortons now is telling you that they're 100% ethical. Everybody wants to be ethical. They just don't want to pay any money. That the Tim Hortons standards, by the way, is basically Tim Hortons hires a private verification company to sort of give them a report every year based on regular standards like, meeting basic minimum wage and stuff like that. Give us a report. Are our producers doing that? And that's their verification. It doesn't matter if they're meeting it or not meeting it. They just want the report. They want an assessment, and that's 100% verified. That would be like saying that, 100% of university students get an A+ because they've come to university. But of course, you go to university, the rest is up to you, your grade. And it's the same thing with verifying companies. You can't just measure your performance and call that verification. So, that's maybe getting lost. But all I'll say is that the trend that you have to buck is being ethical, but not being willing to pay for it and not being willing to make any long-term commitments or sacrifices.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Do companies have an obligation to say no to things that consumers would want, for example? And I think it's an obvious yes. And I would say that, one of the things that we recognize is that companies or cooperatives like Just Us are few and far between. And this is part of the problem. And so, in the question, you also talked at this growth at all costs model. And I would say that is one of the things that while they have an obligation and we know that this is an obligation they should honor, we can't expect them to, because they're also part and parcel of a system that requires continual growth and profitability and, and then competition on a global scale. So we're not really seeing it, but what I would say is that, we're seeing a lot of movement to say, look, we're honoring that obligation. And, again, going back to the climate change question, companies all over the world are making lots of commitments. So net zero is something people are probably hearing plenty about, and the net zero commitments that companies are making. And, I think we should be cautious about these commitments because, one, they're voluntary. They often have target dates of 2050, so very far into the future. But net zero, so getting emissions to net zero by 2050 is not zero. And I think this is one of the key things to remember. So I do research on carbon offsetting, and a lot of the way that these companies are getting to claim really good climate credentials and doing their part and saying we're going to be net zero, they will achieve it through carbon offsetting. So purchasing offsets, and I can talk for a long time about many of the problems with carbon offsets, so rather than reducing emissions at the source. And so, I forget which European country it was, but Shell was taken to court recently because they basically their giant tankers carrying gas around had pictures of big forests on it, and the tanker said, "We're carbon neutral, are you?" And so, many were like, well, that's completely misleading. What is, Shell doing driving these trucks around? So they actually, were found guilty of greenwash. But I have a great example here. carbon neutral natural gas. And so companies are saying, look, our natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, so it's not possible to be carbon neutral in reality, but they're saying, you know, we're carbon neutral. So in 2021, there have been 30 cargoes of so-called carbon neutral liquefied natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, shipped to buyers globally. This is more than 2019 and 2020 combined. And so you may be saying, you know, wait, how is a fossil fuel carbon neutral? And this is because the companies are extracting it, and then they're purchasing carbon offsets, and not often in a transparent way. But it allows them to say that we bought offsets, so the natural gas that we're shipping actually doesn't have a climate impact. It's neutral, but we're actually burning the fossil fuel. So I'm always, you know, thinking to, you know, we should be very cautious in terms of what we're hearing, and we really need to scrutinize what we're being told, because we can't necessarily expect those big companies to do what they should do. So then there is this question of you know, government regulation and what are the things that are required, because I don't know that we can expect consumers, and we're talking about inflation a lot and the cost of everything going up. So making those decisions gets harder and harder, especially depending on your income. So obviously it's very complicated, but you know, I do think that ideally we would be regulating rather than, you know, letting voluntary commitments come down that then aren't well scrutinized.
Thank you all. Nelson, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add.
I'd like to make a contribution possible. I'd like to say something. Yeah, we've been, as I mentioned before, we've been working in our farms and trying to help mitigate the impact of climate change. But I believe that it would be really valuable if governments, if the nations, both from the north and from the south, if they understood the really important effort that represents the small producer production system. If these governments were able to understand what that means, there are many things that governments can do. Maybe they don't even need money to help. It would be enough for them to stop preventing us to do things we want to do, to support the things that we do. And I believe that automatically would help us, for us to be able to reach our consumers through SPP, and so that we create responsible consumption among SPP customers. We receive a lot of advertisement and publicity, and they're lying. That we don't see the realities and the truth. Unfortunately, governments, they are defending the interests of capitalists, of the capitalistic system, and they don't take into account the realities of their communities. And I think this is a phenomenon that's happening both in the south and the north. If they were more aware, they wouldn't be applying so many norms, so many standards, regulations for us to obtain organic certification, because we are not the ones that are causing these climate changes. But nevertheless, small producers are working on
Nelson, we've lost our audio.
unfortunately, Nelson, that's really too bad. Okay, we're being told that everything's okay on their end. Just give me a moment.
Sure. I'll just blame the tech conglomerates that Gavin was telling us about, and that
They
this
must
is
have
an
heard me.
example of colonial data and processes. Yeah. We will probably open up to the floor now, or folks online, while we work to resolve this issue. But before we do that, thank you to all of you for so eloquently and informatively answering my curveball question. I really appreciate it. It definitely was off script. So are there any questions? I know we have some business students actually from Acadia and Dr. Jim Grant's class here. So no pressure, but we are looking to you to save us all. And change the way business is done. So maybe you folks have questions, or if there's anybody else in the audience, or Keely, if we have some folks online with questions. Maybe just if you raise your hand if you're in the audience. I know. Yep. That's a great question, and I know these people have great answers for that. So just for folks online, if you didn't get to hear that, the question was, there's people who believe in and support and perpetuate conventional capitalism, and is there concern that they might be able to infiltrate and corrupt fair trade? And I think some folks here today on the panel have mentioned and used the term authentic fair trade and authentic fair traders, so maybe we could kind of go down that avenue.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways that happens. I mean, one of them is sometimes companies will buy a lot of fair trade, but a very small portion of their overall sales. And so there's a lot of concerns that sort of gives them a halo effect for the rest. So say Starbucks is the perfect example where they don't really tell you anymore how much fair trade they buy. It's difficult to find that information, but it's probably somewhere in the realm of 7% maybe of their coffee is fair trade certified. But they work really, really, really hard to brand themselves as an ethical social justice company. And they would, of course, claim that all their coffee is fairly traded based on their own standards that don't meet fair trade standards. And I'm happy to, they don't have a minimum guaranteed price. They don't have extra money for social premiums to communities. There's other things that they don't have a commitment to gradually moving towards living wages. But, so I think that's the sort of the one classic way. And the other way they do it is, kind of like Britt was sort of indicating, they, in terms of authentic fair trade, well, they kind of shop around. It's the same way that corporations shop around through investment treaties to figure out what countries they want to sue for violating their investment rights. And, there's been a really big lawsuit recently with a Canadian mining company in Eco Oro in Colombia. And it was a very, I can tell you about that in a minute, but it was a really bizarre arbitration decision that favored the mining company. But what they do is they also fish around for their standards. So, Rainforest Alliance has some good standards, but they don't have the kind of income and labor standards that fair trade has. And a lot of the big companies like Hershey's, they prefer that. The average consumer doesn't have the time, nor should they really, to sort one standard out from the other. There's actually a lawsuit that's being triggered recently in the last couple of weeks by a public interest groups trying to take Hershey's to court. I can't remember the country now, saying that they're over-exaggerating the extent to which cocoa that they get, that it's Rainforest Alliance certified, can be considered sustainable and child labor-free. So I think that there are those two things that they do, and of course that is the concern about certifying companies as sustainable. And it's kind of a flip side of offsetting or net zero, is that companies look to make the simplest, cheapest, and most affordable way they can check off that box. And that's the thing, is that SPP has a kind of vision that's very different from box checking, but companies want it to be about checking a box. And if they check the box, that lets them do everything else the way that they want. And in climate change, that has big ramifications.
I just wanted to, just to mention that I think I've read in the book, in one of the articles, as of, a couple of years ago or a year ago, there were 113 eco-labels in Canada. That's a crazy number. Like, imagine going to I imagine some of you do this. You go to the store and you look at all the green labels, and usually the one that's prettiest or says the most you grab, or if you like the brand and it has a green label on it, that's great, and you kind of go about your day. So a lot of those new eco labels are definitely privately operated labels that a company has just decided to make on their own. And I think there's a real challenge. I mean, SPP has gone the route of authentic and really, a high quality, if you can call it that, form of fair trade. And then we have Fair Trade International that has really tried to grow. Fair trade certified coffee makes up 2% or something of the globally traded coffee. 2%. And that's Fair Trade International, which has arguably had to do a little watering down and, meeting certain needs of bigger players so that they could grow the fair trade label. Because like Gavin's saying, those bigger companies don't want to spend money to be seen as ethical. So it's a really challenge. So now you see fair trade, sometimes Fair Trade International, what's the role? Is it to grow it more amongst a bunch of companies that really don't want to do anything and call themselves fair trade at the same time? Is the future more of these international trade agreements, and how do we really make governments accountable and so force companies to have to do something? Does fair trade get to play a role in that kind of process? I don't know, but I know that the question you have is a really important one, and it's happening all around us, and it can be quite discouraging for sure.
I'll just repeat that question. So the question was, why isn't there more regulation and government intervention or concern about fair trade labeling and meeting fair trade standards by government, like we see with things like organic certification?
Well, I can only guess at the exact answer, but what I would say is I am a big fan of regulation, because I think one of the things that happens without regulation is that even well-meaning companies can be beaten out by someone else who chooses the cheaper option. And so there ends up being this kind of like, even companies that want to choose to pay more, they actually have to be competitive against another company. It's not just a kind of choice. It's like, otherwise your company doesn't thrive. Otherwise your company loses out, loses market share, loses customers, and things like that to companies that want to pay less and do it on the cheap. And that's how you're efficient. That's how you're dynamic. That's how you adapt to the marketplace. So I think without regulation, you kind of invariably have this watering down process. And so I'm a big fan of and I could go into that about mechanisms they've used in the past to regulate, say, coffee bean prices to ensure that no coffee is sold under a certain price. But in terms of when it comes to standards, I think that is a battle that needs to be won, actually, in terms of government having some kind of regulation around standards and the claims that they make. Right now, it's a bit of a free-for-all in terms of making whatever claims you want. And the only thing I would say is that the pressure against the government coming up with those regulations is precisely big companies that will say they want flexibilities and things like that. And flexibility can be a very loaded word, because maybe on some issues, like say paying people a living wage, there shouldn't be any flexibility. But I think that becomes a common, Canada was close to having a real ombudsperson that could have some teeth for corporations, and then at the last minute they watered it down so that it was kind of like a typical kind of government position that will probably not ever do anything. And so every time you get close on these debates, you end up with a kind of weak version at the end, and I think it's kind of lobbying and pressure behind the scenes. I don't know if Joey or anybody has more insight than I do on that.
Okay, so we're going to go back to Nelson and let him finish up what he was speaking to us about earlier in response to our question about the obligation and responsibility of brands to say no.
Thank you. Sorry, I was saying that governments, they can do much more to be able to help us. And it doesn't mean they have to invest large sums of money. It would be very important if they took the time to listen to the voice of SPP, for example, to understand what this means for every country, to understand what our contributions mean to improve the conditions in the markets for SPP products and for the conditions of our planet in general. Unfortunately, there is not enough willingness from the governments to be able to listen to our voices. They're too busy with bureaucracy they create laws. They try to provide to defend what's not defendable. Uh, I give you an example. My country, we have a Ministry of Agriculture, and we're supposed to have a representative that represents organic producers. He does nothing at all, but nevertheless, they create bodies, government bodies, to control organic production, while all those artificial fertilizers, venom, poisonous fertilizers, pesticides, they have free way to enter the country and to be used all around the country. But well, in Europe, they're they're making laws a lot more strict for organic producers. We are the ones who are paying the costs of those bad uses of conventional products in our countries. It would be a very good thing that Europe, that the US, and that our own countries, they allowed SPP, they listened to SPP to explain to them what SPP means. They listen to our explanations, but they forget. They don't analyze the advantages that we offer, because unfortunately, all countries, both from the south and the north, they are too worried about capital. They don't care about good conditions for humanity and for people. If they listen to what we have to say, that would be a great thing for SPP, and that would allow us to have access through information, and not just to have access to publicity to confuse us and to deceive us. That's just what I wanted to say about what governments could do. The strategic plan of SPP contemplates to work to advocate. That's such a hard thing to achieve because consumers, they receive a lot of deceiving publicity. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions in the audience or online? Yeah, go ahead.
So in Canada, we have the carbon tax that when you purchase gas, there's a tax on top of it. Should that go back to producers to compensate for what they lose because of climate change?
Well, there's a good question. For folks who didn't maybe hear, the question was, in Canada, we have a carbon tax, and should that money be diverted back to producers who carry an unfair burden of the impact of climate change?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. I think it's a good question because obviously, you know, the question of taxation, it's very political, and there are real ramifications for those who are experiencing the costs. What I would say, you know, if we jump back to, and maybe as business students, you know, you're hearing a lot about this, say the economic theory that says you have to, tax or put a price on what are called negative externalities. So something like carbon is considered a negative externality. It's leading to climate breakdown. It's heating the atmosphere. We've got lots of science on it. And the problem we're told within, the economic theory is that it hasn't been priced. So it's been pretty cheap to actually allow it into the atmosphere. And the idea is that if you put a price on it and you make it expensive enough, you're going to shift behavior into low carbon things. So what I would say is that, and it's actually very interesting in Canada because there is a carbon tax, in different places. We actually have provincially different systems, and the federal government only stepped in for those provinces that said, we're not going to do it. And so they said, you're going to get our system then. So there's the tax, but actually for a lot of the big producers, they are actually involved in a different system of carbon trading with each other, and the government has actually shielded them from most of the price. But you really have to dig into the policy to know it, to recognize that producers are often shielded from the price in that way. Now, if we get into other producers, say agricultural producers, who are saying, well, now the cost of doing business is way more expensive for us. I mean, in theory, that's part of what the tax is supposed to do. But the question is, how do you make it fair enough? So there is the one question to say, the whole point is to make it more expensive, so you shift production. But at the same time, then there are certain sectors or certain actors that it's really hard to afford to be able to afford to do it. So I would say when we're talking about households that live under particular income levels, the money should go back to them because life is becoming much more expensive and they've got way less disposable income to actually be able to live their lives. When we're talking about larger entities and producers who have more of the money available, and we're talking, we can look at their profit margins, we can say there is more, so it might mean more of a hit, but at the same time, if we then shield them from the price, because that we would be sending it back to them, it has no impact. Now the problem is, if you look at systems around the world, the really big producers are all being shielded from the price. So that's part of the politics of putting a price on carbon, that once you start digging into it, we find out that governments are shielding them from the prices because they're worried about the fallout from that. So it gets really tricky as you move forward to figure out how to go about it and also have it be effective. And this is going back to the regulation question. I think sometimes regulation can be much more effective because you're requiring everyone to participate in that. And if we look at its climate impacts in places like California, where there's a price on carbon and lots of regulation, the research shows it's the regulation that has done it because the price is too low, because it's really hard to have a price way too high for everybody.
Can I just say something quick? So what Nelson was just so when we buy coffee at Just Us, there's something called a fair trade social premium that gets added onto the price. There's something called the organic premium that gets added on to the price. And there's also like a set fixed price that we try to set when we agree on contracts. And, our perspective at Just Us is that these kind of, external kind of costs that often don't get incorporated into what producers are doing to grow the coffee. We're trying to include those as much as we can in what we think is a real cost of production. I mean, producers gaining skills in democratic governance of their organizations and creating their own power centers for their needs is a cost of production in our point of view. The organic premium is actually the cost of stewarding the land in a respectful way that producers do. There's any number. There's the cost of climate change mitigation for producers. These are the things that theoretically we're trying to incorporate into these prices, so that. But I mean, there's only a certain point you can go to, right? You want it to be an accessible product here in Canada, here in Wolfville and in Nova Scotia, for people to be able to buy it. So you only have so much you can do if you want everybody to kind of continue on being able to buy it and also maintain businesses in the middle. So it's really tricky, and I think that producers end up being squeezed on this other end as small producers at the very beginning of the chain. And I think it in some ways it comes down, and what Nelson was saying there momentarily a moment ago, was around how producers just need to be able to do what they do and not be regulated to death under organic standards or whatever standards that are being, and these standards often turn into another paternalistic, another controlling aspect of their relationship with those in power. And I think it's really important to I want to pull that out. And there's some degree of that. I mean, regulation of how governments interact with one another is one thing, because those are, quote unquote, relatively, I would say that probably there isn't an equal power dynamic between the Colombian government and the Canadian government necessarily, but they're all kind of playing the same game, unfortunately, in terms of international trade. And what the producer ends up seeing on their end is really just a very tight glove that they have to try to fit within. And in the meantime, they know what needs to be done, and the language that they're speaking is a very different one. It's not one of quality, productivity, efficiency, better yields. It's one of balance in their environment, one of respect for people in their communities. And that all costs money to do that well. But that's not the measuring stick that they're being measured by. And that, I think, underlies many of the issues that we see, is that the global capitalist colonial language is very different than what Nelson is talking about. Taxing things and all these, that's very different. This is a culture of respect and very local communities. They know one another. They do good things to one another because they're all going to feel the consequences of that if they don't. And of course, this is the challenge of trying to reach across the globe and do things in a trusting and respectable way. Of course, there's a lot of players in between, so it's a lot of chance of it getting messed up. But I just wanted to bring that together a little bit with what he was saying earlier. Also, there's a fellow from SPP, Fernando, who's one of the board members, who wanted to make to send a little message to everybody here if we have the time. So if you have another question, I don't know where we're at for time, but I just wanted to mention that.
Well, you tell me where we're at for time. It's something that I think we often forget to consider when we talk about taxation and government, that we're using colonial systems to try and decolonize ourselves. And so that's always going to be in tension, and there's going to be difficulties reconciling things, I think, when we try to do that. So that was a really great question. I appreciate your response, Joey. And can you remind me, of what our time commitments are? 1 o'clock we have to be out of here? 12:30. So we have like 1 minute left.
Yes,
So
we have 1 minute left.
Okay. I thought the fair trade way was to take all the time you need. But we'd be here for a long time, I think, if we did that. So maybe I'll just flip it back to you then, if you want to share comments.
So I think Fernando is there somewhere. He's not pinned onto the. I think I can change this, but just if any of you just have the time to sit and for another couple minutes, Fernando just had a message from SPP.
I just want to make a small comment, if possible.
Sure.
I'm Fernando Rodriguez from Chiapas, Mexico. And I'm currently the vice chair of the Small Producers Symbol. I just wanted to say one small anecdote that has to do with all the many resources that are handled at the global level. In 2014, we had the opportunity to be invited as an organization to participate in an international assembly where we presented, theoretically, we were expecting 3,000 participants from all over the world. We only received 30% of expected participants. This project was held in Cancun, Quintana Roo, in Mexico. There we realized that there are a lot of resources that are destined by each country that tries to improve the conditions for climate change and to avoid all of these effects that we are observing in the last. Nevertheless, there we were able to see that many resources that over the year, all these resources that are allocated they're not executed in their entirety, and most of these resources are allocated and distributed in government bodies of each of the countries, so that they in turn they can develop projects related to this topic. And when we had the opportunity, we as an organization, in that moment we were facing the problem of coffee. We were able to participate with a project that helped to contrast the problem this with this coffee disease. The thing is, we didn't have the possibility. Our project was not approved, and they never replied to us. Just 1 year later, they said that our project was not approved. What's the problem here? Many times we are willing enough, many countries are willing enough to do something to stop climate change, to avoid more affectations over the world, but there are many limitations to be able to access to this finance. I believe that it would be a good thing, maybe through you or through SPP, I don't know who, some to collaborate to be able to allocate some resources from to these organizations such as SPP or others that in some way can help all these kind of climate change projects. But because in general we have a lot of limitations in many parts of the world. Sometimes we do obtain resources, but the governments they take those resources sometimes and they use them for activities that have nothing to do with climate change fight. So I would like to know if it's possible to do something for us to have more access to this kind of financing, and we in turn we help our SPP organic small producers organizations to help them to continue with this kind of projects to protect the environment. Thank you very much.
Just a quick, and just to say, what Fernando is talking about, thank you for that, Fernando. What we talked about authentic fair trade earlier. We talk about fair trade. We talk about this book and decolonizing it and all these things. What we're really talking about here is skipping all the in between. What SPP really created a platform for themselves to speak as small producers, and really tell us in their language what they're looking for from fair trade and from relationships with consumers around the world. And that's because consumers, I think, are having the same issue on our end. Citizens of Canada and of the North are having the same issue where they want to see things happening, and then there's all of this money gets circulated around. Everybody's over in Scotland somewhere talking about billions and trillions of dollars, and how much of it actually goes to, what could a bunch of small producers do with $1 trillion, I wonder? A hell of a lot more, I would guess, than is going to get done in what we're talking about, because it's not, the money, who gets the money, right? And that's what we hear about. The governments in Mexico and Colombia and in various countries, our own governments. I mean, the money gets spent on things that ultimately are relatively extravagant, probably, and useless when it comes down to the real work. And I think that's what's really amazing, when you watch small producers and them trying to speak from their own platform and put together their own projects and really show what they're doing. They're not wasting any money, and they don't need to be strangled to death with regulations and standards, making sure that they use the money just right, which tends to be the kind of colonial approach to, if you get funds, then here's the stipulations. You need to send us the reports. You need to do it this way and that way, and in the end, what's the point? So if consumers, and I think, my understanding on a grander scale of what Fernando is suggesting here is this ability for consumers and producers to actually, let's just avoid all of that in between stuff. What can be done? And, fair trade and buying products that have the SPP logo on them are a means of doing that in many ways, because this organization is using that money very wisely to make things happen for the producers, whether it's climate change or otherwise, some of the social work that they do as well. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. Thanks so much for the extra time we got. Yeah, well, as Vicky said, all the SPP coffee on campus here in Acadia is SPP certified. So you're doing a huge part just in our own local community around that. That that money is going to the organization that Fernando and Nelson have worked so hard for, and the organizations that they're involved in as producer organizations as well. So, yeah, no, thanks for that, Vicky. It's an important point.
I think that's a really kind of great point to almost closing consider, because I'll give folks one more time to chime in. But what would happen if the people who can't afford to waste had control of the resources? So while I mull on that one, I'll ask Gavin and Kate if you have any closing remarks you want to share.
Well, the only thing I'll say at the end, that's a great comment, and actually I'm really thinking about the discussion we've just had. The only thing, just to clarify to people too, one of the things with the SPP is that they have very rigorous standards, but they're very clear, and they're very direct in many ways. And a lot of, as the discussion goes here, it's interesting how much corporations love to add more and more and more standards. And that's actually been criticized for being a very colonial thing. It's like, here's 2,000 standards we want you to meet. We're going to help you by dumping standards on you. And so it's there's quite a critique about that. And in fair trade, where it came to head is on what they sometimes call a social premium or a community premium, which is additional money paid to the community that the community themselves decide how to use. And big transnationals hate that premium. Not because of the money, they hate it because it's very hard for them to measure and track. They want to be able to tell somebody, we did 10,000 of these. And when it's a community project that the community themselves is deciding on, they don't know how to measure that at the big scale. So that's just as my final point. And the last thing I'll just tell, Nelson is there. But also, just for your interest, Nelson and everybody else, because we've been emailing about this last couple of weeks, but St. Mary's University just emailed me this morning and confirmed that they are gonna pay for a Spanish translation of the book. So we're gonna get that put together for the next couple months. So
awesome.
you'll hear more from me on that. So.
Well, I'll keep it brief just because I see the time here. But again, building on this theme of regulation and what we're doing, I think when it comes to something like climate change, regulation should be there to move us into the world we want to go to. They shouldn't be there so that the kinds of work that we see through the SPP and what Nelson is doing to limit what they're doing, which is already a good thing. So the question is where you target it to actually transition us to where we need to go. And it's not about making life harder and more costly for small producers who are already doing a good job, and they should be the models that we are looking at for lessons. So it's really about, who you're targeting, and small producers are not these carbon intensive giants that we should be talking about when we're talking about transitioning away. So I think that's an important distinction to make. And otherwise, it's been a great project to participate in, because I think what we see from all of the contributors is that there's many positive things happening, even though there's lots of negatives out there. We do see all of these examples, and they're meaningful, and we should be holding on to them and learning from them.
Thank you. Nelson, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to share with our audience?
Yes. First of all, I want to thank you all for this time that you gave SPP for us to be able to be heard. And I don't know, it would be very important to be able to have contact with the voices from the governments, for them to listen to SPP. If they are able to listen to us, they would be able to have very good ideas that we have. We've been working for 16 years to have a united voice of small producers to make it heard. I think it's not a lot asking to ask to all governments from from the north and from the south to listen to the SPP. I think if you listen to us, we will all benefit from that. Thank you very much for this work today. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess lastly, thank you all for your contributions. Thank you for this wonderful book. Thank you to the contributors of the book. Thank you to the Canadian Fair Trade Network for their role today. Thank you for Just Us for hosting it. And most importantly, thank you to all of you who are concerned about having a more just world for all of us. I think Nelson said that when we listen to producers, we all benefit. And so I think our challenge today as we leave is to remind ourselves that producers are speaking. Are we listening? So thank you all very much.
And just to let everybody know, this was a fair trade event today, and thanks so much to from the support of Katie. Katie is a fair trade campus, which should be noted as well. And yeah, thanks for everybody for making it out tonight. Today, it was great to see everybody. It's nice to have the show up. So thanks so much.